pleasure to introduce the panel from the Environmental Law Center at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. Calvin Sandborn is the legal director of the ELC. He's been instrumental in leading the ELC's law reform work for many years and continues to pioneer cutting edge work. And Edith Barabash is the articled student at the Environmental Law Center. She's working on a number of initiatives as part of her training to become a lawyer in the province. And Adele DesBrisay is the co-op student, and she is the third member of our panel today, and they will each be sharing some of the work they have been doing on specifically plastic reform, which has been a focus for the Environmental Law Center for a number of years. So without any further ado, let me hand it over to them.
Thanks, Renata. I'm going to go first here just to talk about what the Environmental Law Center at UVic has done on plastics. And some of this is going to respond to the last questions that we heard just before the break about so-called biodegradable products and so-called compostable products that don't compost in any known composting system known in British Columbia, and to green. But I'm just going to start at the beginning. 5 years ago, the Environmental Law Center got involved with the plastics issue, and our law students started working on a report to look at this issue where we know that we got up to 20 million tons of plastic going into the ocean every year, that we've got floating continents of plastic, that in the Straits of Georgia near Vancouver, that we've got 3,000 particles of microplastic in every cubic meter of seawater, that the salmon that are coming back to the British Columbia coast are ingesting up to 90 particles of plastic every day as they come back to their homes, that the shellfish on Vancouver Island, every sample taken was finding plastic in it. We all know the stories about the 1 million birds a year annually that die with plastics, and 100,000 turtles and marine mammals that die, countless numbers of fish. We know that this is critical to the climate change problem, that every 20 years we've had a doubling of plastics production in the world, and that's increasing, and that by 2050, that 15% of the total carbon footprint of the Earth will be arising from plastic. So we thought we'd better start taking this issue on. And so in 2017, we produced a report called 7 Reforms to Address Marine Plastic Pollution. And this was just a report calling for a ban on harmful single-use plastics and calling for control on stormwater outlets to reduce plastics going into the ocean, called for regulations of microplastics, for programs to recover fishing gear, fishing nets, fishing traps, crab traps out of the ocean to get all that plastic out of the ocean. And it called for extended producer responsibility programs of producers. And it specifically called for Canada to launch a national plastic strategy. So we believe in working with community groups. So we work with community groups that started a campaign in favor of this strategy. And the community groups got Gord Johns, a member of Parliament, to put forward a motion in the Parliament of Canada to adopt such a national plastic strategy. Motion 151 received almost 200,000 signatures in support on an online petition. And that led to the students at the University of Victoria meeting with Environment Minister Jonathan Wilkinson. At the time he was Parliamentary Secretary, but shortly to become Environment Minister, as well as the member of Parliament that had put forward our motion. So we had a bipartisan meeting in our offices of the Environmental Law Center, where the MPs from the different parties agreed that there should be a national plastic strategy. In the meeting with the minister, he raised the point that there was not federal jurisdiction to do such a national strategy. And I should mention that Renata, who's here, actually then went on and did our second report, which was a response to his argument that the feds did not have a jurisdiction to do much about this plastics problem. And I have to acknowledge that the federal government is using some of the arguments that Renata developed in this document in bringing in the new legislation that Edith and Adele are about to describe to you. So at any rate, we went on to do another report to the provincial government, the government of British Columbia, asking for a ban on single-use plastics. So this report we did for a group called Kids for a Plastic-Free Canada. And we had kids from the ages of 10 to 18 meet with the Minister of Environment and present this report. It was quite great when the Minister of Environment said that he couldn't do too much provincially. He wanted to wait and see what the federal government was doing. And to see the response from the 18-year-old student who he had underestimated. He kind of spoke down to her, and it turns out she was an international debate champion, had just won a championship in debate at Oxford University. And it was a sight to behold to see this 18-year-old do a Greta Thunberg to the Minister of Environment around this submission. At any rate, we went on, we did other reports on recycling, which is not really the solution to this stuff. Recycling all too often is just a rationale for more plastics. And the plastic industry has used that as a rationale. So we've had some successes, and we've seen the federal government establish programs to recover plastic fishing gear out of the ocean in British Columbia. And we've had the success that Edith and Adele are going to talk about with the federal government. Two other things that I'll just mention briefly. We had students work with a local group in Prince George, British Columbia, where the plastics industry was proposing a new plastics plant. Because as the oil and gas industry loses market share on transportation and on heating, they're looking for expansion. Like, what are they going to do with this glut of natural gas that they've had? And the solution has been, well, what the world needs is more plastic. And so they're proposing these mega plastic plants around North America. And we were able to join with citizens there and stop the Prince George plant. And finally, just before I sign off here, a really fun thing that came out of our campaign for a national plastics strategy was that I published an article with Margaret Atwood in the Globe and Mail as we called for this strategy. The next day, the president of Keurig Canada sent me an email saying that he had the solution to the plastics problem, and it was Keurig coffee pods. You know, see that, you know, those little pods that you make a single cup of coffee in the machine. At any rate, he sent this email saying that this was a solution. And when we looked at their ads, we discovered, no, this is greenwashing. This is false advertising. And so we took them to the Competition Bureau. And I am glad to say that in January, the Competition Bureau of Canada fined Keurig Canada $3 million for false advertising, ordered them to pay $800,000 to an environmental group for environmental work to clean up plastics, and also ordered them to change all their advertising and all their packaging, and to issue a retraction in all the major newspapers and media of Canada saying that they had breached the misleading advertising stuff. So I think the future of control of plastics may lie in false advertising litigation. So I'll just turn it over to Edith and Adele.
All right, wonderful. I'm just going to share my screen, and then Edith is going to take it away.
Thank you. Okay, awesome. So let's just go maybe to the next slide, because we got a bit of a background on who we are already. I just want to give some context to this report and why we put it together. So on December 25th, 2021, the Environment and Climate Change Canada posted a proposed single-use plastics prohibition regulation under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is one of Canada's most important pieces of environmental legislation. And we had this opportunity to provide a comment to the federal government on the proposed regulations on behalf of a client. So reading it over, we knew we wanted to applaud the government for a lot of the really positive steps that they took in the regulations, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But we also wanted to make sure that we were preventing any kind of loopholes and that the regulations were strong enough, because they're already taking this really important step, and we wanted to make sure that they're doing it well. So we do think that the proposed ban is a really powerful move towards phasing out single-use plastics. And we actually spent a lot of time comparing this legislation to others and to other jurisdictions and trying to figure out how we can strengthen it. And that actually helped us realize what a world leader this legislation actually is in terms of single-use plastic bans. So that was really exciting to discover. So just a little overview of what the proposed ban would apply to. It would be single-use checkout bags, single-use plastic checkout bags, cutlery, food serviceware, so clamshell containers and boxes and cups and plates that are made of certain problematic plastics, ring containers, so those bands that go around drinks to hold them together so they're easier to carry, stir sticks, and straws. And this is an oversimplification because the definitions do exclude certain items, but we'll get into that shortly. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the 6 items that are prohibited, despite some shortcomings that we'll talk about, are, we think, a really great step forward. We mentioned in our report how harmful single-use plastics are in the ocean and how deeply they actually impact Canada and the rest of the world, just by the sheer number or sheer volume of plastic that's in our waterways. And Calvin talked a little bit about that earlier. There's that staggering statistic about the Strait of Georgia where there's over 3,000 particles of plastic found per cubic meter of seawater there. So that's, of course, ingested by wildlife and causes a whole host of other issues. So preventing any of that plastics is a good thing. So we wanted to make sure to commend the federal government for that in our report. Another great thing about it is that the regulations proposed to ban food serviceware that's made from expanded or extruded polystyrene. This is also known as styrofoam. And this is a huge win for us because styrofoam is an especially harmful type of plastic, both for the environment and also for human health. And the problem with styrofoam is that styrofoam, as many of you might know, it kind of fragments into little plastic pieces really easily. And then it's almost impossible to clean up, but it'll stay in the environment for many years. And it's also really difficult to recycle and actually almost never gets recycled because only undyed or uncontaminated styrofoam can be recycled. So essentially that anything that had touched food is a no-go in terms of recycling. And also the regulations prohibit the use of food serviceware that contain an additive called carbon black, which dyes it black. And this is just in terms of helping to sort waste because black plastics are really hard to sort out. So that was another positive addition to the regulations. So another part, and this kind of goes back to the conversation that was had in the previous presentation. A part of the regulation that we really do commend is that it treats conventional and non-conventional plastics in the same way, meaning that plastic is still banned, even if it's labeled compostable or biodegradable. And the reason for that is that we don't want to rely on alternative plastics at the moment. There aren't actually any kind of standards for what is compostable or biodegradable. And there have been studies showing that if compostable plastic as it is now is littered, it would actually have the same effect on the environment as traditional plastics. They take just as long to degrade in marine environments, which then can actually cause more issues because they can degrade into microplastics, and that leads into a host of other issues. So we do really support this blanket ban on plastics at the moment, at least until we have something better, which we'll talk more about later in the presentation.
All right. So our next part here is on what we hope to see changed in these regulations. So our first thing here is the definitions of single-use plastics and cutlery and straws. We're going to get a little bit more into all of these at a little bit later on in this presentation, but as a general overview, these definitions of cutlery and straws, the exclusion of lids and some plastics from the definition of single-use plastic food serviceware, the exclusion of produce bags from the plastic bag ban, and the exemption for manufacturers and importers of those listed single-use plastics when they're being manufactured and imported for the purpose of export. So right now, single-use plastic cutlery and single-use plastic straws in these proposed regulations are defined as items that change shape when immersed in water maintained at between 82 and 86 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes. And the concern here is that we're going to get industries designing thicker and more durable plastics so that they can be immersed in water at 86 degrees for 15 minutes without changing shape. And at that point, their cutlery and straws would no longer be considered single use, and so would not be encompassed by the bans, but in practice would likely still primarily be single use. So now we have effectively single-use cutlery and straws that are more energy intensive to produce and take longer to degrade in the environment. So what we did is we looked at a bunch of jurisdictions and how they worded their bans, and a lot of them use a design or intent-based standard. So what that means is that an item is single use if it is designed to be single use or is intended by the manufacturer to be single use. And then we looked at how those bans have worked out in practice. And we found a couple examples of the same issue happening. Industry would simply make their products more durable and then would market them as reusable. So same issue there. The other option is the practice-based standard. So what actually happens in practice? Are these plastics actually reused? And what we ended up going with is all of them. So our proposed definition was sort of items that are not generally reused multiple times. So that is that practice-based standard, that are not designed or intended to be reused, which is the intent or design-based standard, or that after being immersed in water, maintained at between 82 and 86 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes, changes shape. So that is that performance-based standard from the original proposed bans. And the key here is that we used or instead of and. So as long as we are hitting one of those three options, the product is still considered single use and is covered under the ban. So the second thing we wanted to change, we proposed changing, is the definition of single-use plastic food serviceware. So the definition now defines plastic food serviceware as sort of a number of food serviceware shapes, so bowls, cups, plates, etc., that are designed to carry food that is ready to eat, and that is made of one of these listed problematic plastics. And all we want to do to this definition here is to add lids to the listed food serviceware shapes, and also add plastics with additives that are toxic to human health in that list of banned plastics. So specifically, we proposed adding phthalates and biphenyls. Some of these chemicals have been proven to have toxic effects to human health, and that sort of includes various cancers and affects reproductive function and immune function, and have been linked to behavioral and developmental issues in children. So a number of very serious health effects. And those chemicals have been banned in a lot of childcare products, and others are currently undergoing a review process to determine whether they should be banned. And a lot of the preliminary evidence on these alternatives says that they're pretty toxic. So the next logical step here is banning these sort of entire classes of chemicals in the products out of which we are eating. So our third thing is we think the ban on checkout bags should be expanded to include plastic produce bags. This one is pretty simple. Produce bags are just very easily replaced with going bag free or with using reusable produce bags. So we would love to see that expanded to include not just checkout bags. And our fourth thing that we proposed changing in the regulations is the export ban. So right now, under the proposed ban, you can still manufacture and import these single-use plastics as long as you were then exporting them. And the issue with that is that our plastics problem is a global problem. As it stands, these regulations allow companies to harm wildlife and pollute environments as long as it is in another country. And we don't think that that is consistent with the goals of the ban, which are to reduce plastic waste and plastic pollution. So those are the four changes that we proposed. I'm going to pass it back to Edith to chat about some of the other actions that we would love to see happen.
Great, thank you. So here's some of our hopes for things that can be done outside of these particular regulations, or that can be added to these regulations that can help Canada get farther ahead on the single-use plastics problem. And maybe some of these might get you thinking about what Iceland is doing or isn't doing or can do. So one of these is, of course, banning additional single-use plastic items. While the 6 items that are in the proposal right now are a great start, there are a lot of other types of single-use plastics that we should also be looking at as well. These include single portion water bottles, coffee pods, which have, as Calvin mentioned, a history of really badly contaminating recycling streams because people think that they're recyclable when they aren't. Plastic cigarette filters, which have been found in just staggering numbers on shorelines in beach cleanups. Plastic packaging around produce is another big one. So just that really unnecessary plastic that's around certain fruits and vegetables. And the next one is creating national standards for compostable, biodegradable, and bio-based plastics. So as we mentioned earlier, part of the reason that it's important to currently not differentiate between conventional and non-conventional plastics is because we don't have any kind of overarching standards for how these plastics need to act and how they need to break down. And if there are some kind of standardized criteria, then that might help fix that problem. And we propose having something similar to something like a certifying body similar to Eco Logo that can oversee this and make sure that compostable and biodegradable plastics are actually composting and biodegrading properly and within a certain amount of time, and also to make sure that they can actually be composted in existing facilities instead of just being hypothetically compostable. The next one is implementing a monitoring program for plastic pollution so that we can actually assess the effectiveness of this. We do hope in the future that this list of items is expanded and adapted depending on developing research and information. And we think that the only way to really do this is by monitoring its effectiveness and giving us an overview of what's actually happening on the ground after the ban is implemented. And finally, the problem doesn't end with these single-use plastics that we use as consumers. It's really important to regulate other very harmful plastics. And we know from a broader perspective that the majority of marine plastics are actually coming from things like discarded fishing gear and the big, floating docks that are used in fish farms. So it's time to really take those kinds of plastics seriously because that's a huge global problem as well. And we need to make sure that these single-use plastic bans don't detract from the big picture issues, and that we can, tackle those problems as well. So that's basically an overview of our report that we put together. And yeah, I think we're happy to answer any questions about it. It's been really interesting delving into it. So hopefully we can shed some light on what other jurisdictions can be doing as well.
Renata, is there time for questions?
I think we can take a couple. Yvonne is running to the microphone to take some.
I'm running for unmuting us. This was so interesting also.
Chiming in questions in the chat.
Yeah, there was Calvin has actually already answered one question. Thank you very much for that. But there is another question, and I'm so totally not an expert in this that I don't even understand the question, but I'm sure you do. Why don't you use market-based instruments instead of command and control regulation?
Well, I think we should be doing both. We should do command control and we should do market-based incentives. In fact, they have tried to do economic incentives in the control of shopping bags. And in some instances, that's worked, but not as effectively as a total ban. So we thought that in these particular instances of these particular types of single-use plastics, that you did need to just ban. There's absolutely no need for plastic stir sticks. And the polystyrene containers do such damage once they get into the environment and then break down into forever particles of styrofoam, smaller and smaller, but yet still perennial plastics in the environment that get eaten by creatures and cause other environmental harms, that there was an urgency to simply do a command and control ban. But I take the point that we do need to be looking at incentives, but incentives that are designed to actually get off of the plastic merry-go-round. Like, there needs to be a real total shift in paradigm here. We simply cannot afford to be doubling plastic use in the world every 20 years. Like, we're on a very constrained ecosystem here, and we have to take effective action. And that's it. It was thought that these were the first steps in effective action.
And thank you so much. And I really liked the statement that we should just sue those companies who do, I don't know, the wrong advertisement.
Oh yeah, we're working on our second lawsuit.
Well.
Adele's already onto it.
Yeah, we should do that here as well. I think Sean and I just recently looked into exactly those coffee thingies.
Coffee pods.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the thing about those coffee pods was that the company was advertising. They were suckering people into thinking they were doing something green by buying this product. But in fact, what was happening, pursuant to the Keurig ads, was that people were throwing contaminated coffee pods into the recycling system, and it was costing the city of Toronto hundreds of thousands of dollars to deal with these damn pods. And they pled with the company to stop advertising that you could use these pods and easily discard them into the blue boxes. And the company didn't accede to those pleas from the city of Toronto. So it's not only just greenwashing and hoodwinking, they were actually undermining an existing environmental system.
Yeah.
You know, there's kind of a weird psychology about this kind of advertising that convinces consumers that they no longer need to feel guilty about buying a product. You know, people want to believe that they're not causing harm, but when they get false advertising about it, it actually makes it impossible for the problem to be solved.
Yeah.
If I could touch quickly also upon the cost benefit analysis question, part of our jurisdictional scan for when we were researching what to propose included looking at the impacts on other jurisdictions, the impacts of these bans, and some more about that is in our report, but we did discover that some bans did lead to like really high landfill diversion rates and actually did have really positive impacts. So it's not like a full cost benefit analysis, but we did look at how this is played out in other jurisdictions.
Which brings us a bit to the Icelandic, but I think Sean wanted to.
I believe Stacy has a question.
Yeah.
Maybe she should go first.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Calvin, because you talked about the national push to ban the plastic, single-use plastic. And I remember the debate in 2021. Most people in Ontario are saying the government hasn't gone far enough in banning the small stuff. And therefore, the federal government approached the manufacturers, several manufacturers in Ontario, because being a major manufacturing province in Canada, to try and start altering their packaging, because single-use plastic includes a lot of things, not just the small stuff. And then when my province, Alberta, saw this, and Alberta relies on oil, it's their backbone, their breadbasket, it pulled out of the national negotiations. So now how are provinces working to at least, facilitate unification in banning this? Because when one province pulls out, then the rest will say, why should we carry on with this?
Yeah, that's really problematic. And I don't know if we're ever going to get Alberta at the forefront of progressive change on oil and gas. But we do call for federal and provincial action, that neither jurisdiction can solve this alone. And I think with the possible exception of Alberta, that probably the prospects are pretty good. I think in the rest of Canada, the other 9 provinces, that there's broad consensus, which I think was reflected in that private members motion that I talked about, that where we got almost 200,000 signatures in support of it. That motion to develop a national plastic strategy passed in the House of Commons unanimously. There wasn't a single vote against it.
Yeah, but now it was meant to come in 2021, and it's been postponed to 2022 sometime. And so what is happening? What's causing the stoppage?
The stoppage on the federal ban, are you talking about?
Yeah.
Well, there was a delay, I think, partially because of the pandemic, but this is proceeding. I think the federal government is fully behind it. And in fact, in their budget yesterday, they were stating that this was going full steam ahead this year.
I have a question, if that's all right. So I'd like to thank you for a wonderful discussion, first and foremost. I'm particularly excited about this discussion surrounding a sort of a need for a national strategy relating to plastics. I was just wondering, have there been any recommendations regarding these so maybe scientifically informed standards for testing efficacy in terms of biodegradability in the environment, making sure that those standards are, reflective of the actual environments that plastics will end up in?
Yeah, Edith or Adele, did you want to take that, or I can if you want.
You can go ahead, Calvin.
Oh, well, yeah, there is a lot of discussion on that, and a lot of work being done on that. And in my view, it is urgent because so many people are being misled by misleading claims of compostability and biodegradability. And we need to have those standards so that truly compostable and biodegradable products can be dealt with. But then we also have to look at the systems, because even if it's a truly biodegradable product, it becomes problematic if the truly biodegradable product gets mixed into a plastic stream in the blue boxes, and that can cause problems with the contamination of the blue box plastic recycling. So there's a lot of work to be done before those products are the solution, in my view.
I'm just wondering, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, just to add, we looked a little bit at there's the Biodegradable Products Institute label, which is kind of a regulating body that's looking into this. But again, it would also have to be, like Calvin mentioned, it would have to not just work theoretically, it would have to work in practice in the specific locations that it's being implemented in. So I guess it also depends on the infrastructure in place in the location. But there are certifying bodies looking at how these plastics are being broken down.
Yeah, like one of the problems is that you can have a perfectly good compostable, biodegradable product, and if it's kept away from other plastics at a restaurant where everything is that magic compound, and it's kept in its own pure stream, and then you can compost it and allow it to biodegrade. The problem is when people take those products out of that restaurant, walk down the street and toss it into a blue box with plastic recycling. So how do we deal with that? And so we've got to be doing some thinking about that. Otherwise, these products can actually screw things up. And so, you know, it's a good example is those Keurig pods that were supposedly this great recycling phenomenon that we're going to be the miracle, you know, that the president of Keurig Canada said that they would be, was actually a net negative to recycling in Toronto.
I might be showing my age here, but I mean, I remember back in the 80s and 90s, you know, when the plastics industry was on their recycling campaign. One of the promises that they made would, you know, be some sort of magical sorting system, you know, that would, you know, be able to tell the difference. But, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, we're still dealing with, you know, an IR-based sensor that can't differentiate between polyethylene terephthalate and polylactic acid. So, I mean, I just think it's interesting, you know, despite all the promises 40 years on, you know, it still comes back to, you know, the sorting issue.
And really the solution goes back to grandma who said, don't waste things. Stop producing so much waste.
Yeah, totally.